Spider-Man has one of the most iconic superhero costumes of all time, but it hasn't always been easy for video games to render the red, blue, and webbing of your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. If you need proof of just how far video game tech has come in the last 40 years, you need only compare those earliest games to the visual splendor of Insomniac's Spider-Man. Now let's take a look back at some of the most significant Spider-Man games and a couple of weird cameos and how the video game industry has spent years trying to bring the Marvel icon to life. 20 years after his comic book debut, Spider-Man made his first video game appearance on the Atari 2600, and it shouldn't come as a shock that the cutting-edge early 80s gaming tech wasn't really cut out to handle Spidey's iconic costume. The game relies on a couple of dozen red and blue pixels to evoke that fairly complex design. Now, to be fair, it kind of works, but only in a minimalist and abstract way. With 1982 Spider-Man coming just before the industry-wide crash, it would be several years before a company made an honest go at adapting this hero to games. Spidey made his big gaming comeback in the late 80s with new systems like the NES, Game Boy, and Sega Genesis, offering a relatively more accurate take on the franchise. Publisher LJN even released a full trilogy of Spider-Man games on the Game Boy. Now, as difficult as it is to recreate Spider-Man and his rogues with an 8-bit processor and a monochromatic screen, it was certainly an improvement over the Atari game. The Game Boy trilogy was also notable for prominently featuring the art of contemporary Spidey artists like Mark Bagley in the packaging and manuals. The games also included comic book style panels and cutscenes. Weirdly enough, the most impressive looking Spider-Man games in this era came from the places you'd least expect. The 1989 PC Spider-Man and Captain America in Dr. Doom's Revenge featured detailed sprites far above what fans were seeing from Nintendo's consoles. That same year, Spidey also appeared as an unlicensed boss in Revenge of the Shinobi, again with a more detailed and comic-inspired look. However, both games showed us the real weaknesses of gaming hardware and low-resolution televisions of the time. There was simply no way to render the distinctive webbing patterns on Spider-Man's costume. As the console wars between Nintendo and Sega began to heat up in the early 90s, Spidey's gaming career really started to take off. Games like Spider-Man and the X-Men in Arcade's Revenge and The Amazing Spider-Man vs. the Kingpin took advantage of the newer 16-bit consoles. The Sega CD port of The Amazing Spider-Man vs. the Kingpin set a new standard for the franchise, with larger, more colorful sprites and more comic-accurate sprites to play with. But the real breakthrough of Spidey was with 1993's Maximum Carnage. This side-scrolling brawler is based on the comic book crossover of the same name, and for the time, it did a pretty admirable job of capturing the look of the comics. Spidey himself is clearly modeled after Mark Bagley's art, with those distinctive oversized eyes and exaggerated anatomy. The game's cutscenes also rip panels directly from the comics. While games like Maximum Carnage showed how close developers were getting to recreating the look and feel of the Spider-Man comics, Capcom set a new standard for Spidey and his fellow Marvel heroes. Starting with 1995's Marvel Superheroes and continuing into spin-offs like Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter and Marvel vs. Capcom, the Japanese developer created one of the most visually striking takes on Spider-Man we've ever seen. The Marvel vs. Capcom games are clearly inspired by the work of artist Todd McFarlane, mixed with a healthy dose of manga styling. This Spidey has those same enormous eyes and gangly anatomy, but even more importantly, the games capture the hunched posture and arachnid-like sense of movement that made McFarlane a comic book superstar in the first place. About all that's missing in these games is that pesky webbing. The Marvel vs. Capcom series is the first to show superhero fans that video games can not only capture the power of comic book art, but lend their own flavor to boot. Spider-Man crossed into a new frontier with the rise of the Sony PlayStation. Neversoft's 2000 Spider-Man game was the first to truly let players control Spidey in 3D. The game laid the foundation most 3D Spider-Man adventures have built on ever since. But as revolutionary as the game was, there was only so much the rudimentary PlayStation hardware could do to capture the comics. This Spider-Man is squat and blocky, a far cry from the sleek, dynamic hero seen in games like Marvel vs. Capcom. And even in 3D, the webbing on Spidey's costume was still a pipe dream. That didn't change much in Spidey's various other PlayStation-era appearances, whether in 2001's Spider-Man 2 sequel or cameo appearances in games like X-Men Mutant Academy or Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2. For the first 2 decades of Spider-Man's video game career, his costumes' webbings always proved to be the one thing developers couldn't capture. Video game graphics simply weren't detailed or high-res enough to depict those finer details. That finally changed with the PlayStation 2, GameCube, and Xbox generation. Maybe it's fitting that the first Spider-Man game to emphasize the costume's webbing was Spider-Man the movie, which adapted the Tobey Maguire costume and its distinctive raised webbing style. While very dated by today's standards, the graphics were a revelation at the time. Gone was the blocky, ugly Spider-Man of the PlayStation 1 era, replaced by a newer, sleeker version that very clearly evoked the movies, and the graphics only improved in the 2004 and 2007 sequels. The movie-style Spider-Man got one last hurrah in Spider-Man Friend or Foe. That game is unique in that it borrows from Spider-Man 3's approach to both Spidey and Venom, but also mixes things up with more cartoonish proportions and colors. Though it hardly ranks among the best Spider-Man games, Friend or Foe is perhaps the first 3D title to really carve out its own niche when it comes to Spider-Man's appearance.
I'd like to thank you all for being so very punchable.
Having more or less mastered the look of the movie Spider-Man, Activision turned its attention to games more directly influenced by the comics. 2005's Marvel Ultimate Alliance drew mostly from Marvel's Ultimate Universe and artists like Brian Hitch for its look and feel, taking a relatively grounded approach to Spidey and his fellow heroes. Think of it as an early version of what the MCU would later set out to do. On the far other end of the spectrum, 2005's Ultimate Spider-Man proved to be the most ambitious attempt yet at translating a Spider-Man comic into an interactive game. The game relied on tech-dubbed comic inking animation, a very stylized form of cel shading that makes 3D polygonal characters look very much like Mark Bagley's hand-drawn artwork. In fact, the game was so faithful to Bagley and Brian Bendis' Ultimate Spider-Man comics that its story was presented as a direct spin-off of that series.
Spider-Man, you are needed.
Madam Web? As if this night wasn't strange enough already.
Spidey's biggest success in this period came with 2010's Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions. Years before Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse popularized the concept of multiple versions of Spidey joining forces, Shattered Dimensions allowed players to assume control of 4 different heroes. The game doesn't necessarily draw from any one artist's interpretation of Spider-Man, but instead takes a more classical and timeless approach. Shattered Dimensions also proved to be a showcase for how much lighting can be used to bring a comic book feel to a 3D Spider-Man game. Each of the 4 Spider-Men featured in the game occupies a unique world, whether it's the neon-drenched landscape of Spider-Man 2099 or the shadowy, washed-out realm of Spider-Man Noir. Games like Ultimate Alliance and Shattered Dimensions also popularized the trend of including multiple alternate Spider-Man costumes. That trend peaked in the mobile game Spider-Man Unlimited, which featured literally dozens of alternate costumes drawn from every corner of the Marvel Comics multiverse. And like Ultimate Spider-Man before it, Unlimited made liberal use of cel shading tech to make its 3D models look like 2D drawings.
Regret your life choices yet?
The 2000s proved that gaming consoles have finally evolved to the point where Spider-Man can be faithfully recreated in polygonal form. Nowadays, the challenge is finding ways for games to not just replicate the source material, but add to it and expand it. That's where Insomniac comes in. Their release of Marvel's Spider-Man delivers what is undoubtedly the most fully realized version of Peter Parker in any video game form. That goes for his costume as much as his backstory and character relationships. The game introduces a new take on the iconic suit, one that transforms a simple spandex onesie into a more detailed and functional costume with a giant white spider emblem to set it apart. Harkening back to the classic Marvel vs. Capcom days, the game also takes pains to give the main character an exaggerated spider-like posture, whether he's battling Mr. Negative's goons or just swinging through the New York skyline. Not content to simply add one spider suit to the mix and call it a day, Marvel's Spider-Man features several dozen unlockable costumes. Some are direct riffs on iconic comic book storylines or past Spider-Man movies. Others, like the advanced suit, are completely new creations that push an iconic design in new directions. Insomniac even turned to Marvel artists like Adi Granov and Gabriel Dell'Otto for design help. That trend continues in the 2020 spin-off Spider-Man Miles Morales. Because Miles hasn't been around long enough to have a wardrobe as big as Peter's, the game leans even more heavily on original costume designs. In a special treat for movie fans, one of those costumes happens to be the suit from the Into the Spider-Verse movie, complete with an animation style that mimics the choppy frame rate of the movie. That's how far Spider-Man games have come in 40 years. We've gone from a couple dozen pixels to a game that literally looks like an interactive movie. There's no telling how Spider-Man's look will continue to evolve in the next 40 years. Now I want to end this video by asking you, that's right, you the viewer, what's your favorite Spider-Man video game appearance? Let us know in the comment section down below. And for all things Spider-Man related, keep it locked right here on IGN.
You gotta take the oath.
Oh. Okay.
I promise to do everything in my power to protect this city.
I promise.
That's it?
That oath a real thing?
Totally. Definitely didn't just make it up.